I'm making a video on something called lithium ion capacitors. I read about these about a year ago, and I found them pretty interesting at the time, although I didn't really see like an application for them right away. So I recently looked into them because I read something somewhere mentioning a 2.7 hour duration for a lithium ion capacitor. And so the way capacitors work is they typically discharge over a few seconds, and I read here while standard EDLCs typically discharge in about 30 seconds, LICs discharge over a few minutes, an important distinction in power quality solutions on the edge. So when I read this, I decided to look into these as like battery replacements. And I know that they don't really use a lot of power, but I found a few types of microcontrollers that use very little power. So as you can see here, they have an energy density of about 6 times less than a lithium-ion battery, but also 6 times more than a supercapacitor. And the reason this is interesting is because, supercapacitors can only run for a few seconds, but, with lithium-ion batteries, they need to run a lot longer. And of course, with something like a cell phone, you probably want it to be running for more than a few seconds. So one of the devices that I've been looking into is it is a microcontroller, and here is one of the microcontroller boards that runs very low power. This runs at about 6 milliamps, and it is running at about 83 days on a 1500 milliamp battery, which is more like a standard phone battery. Of course, it is only displaying on a monochrome screen here, but these are some pretty exotic components here that you may not really see in a standard phone. But nonetheless, if you combine these things with a standard battery, you can get some pretty impressive results, and that is actually even without the solar panel. So a solar panel can actually recover some of the battery, but as he did mention here, it is running at about 83 days. So when you combine these two things, 83 days is more than enough than most people would use. But when I looked at these lithium-ion capacitors, I didn't really think about how they kind of convert into milliamp hours, and that's actually what I'm more familiar with when it comes to batteries, because I kind of can get an idea of if something is in milliamp hours, you can kind of get a better estimate of how many hours it will last, because obviously if you have something running at 6 milliamp hours, it can probably run at like 90 divided by 6. But anyways, I was just checking this thing here, and I saw 90 milliamps, and I thought that was actually what I was looking for, because that suggests that it runs continuously. And that is actually more revolutionary than I had thought of before, because, again, this is a supercapacitor, but it runs like a battery. Now, if you're running a lithium-ion capacitor, even on a 250 farad capacitor, that's 5 days. Now, it's a little bit larger than, a flatter type of battery, but, I mean, a lot of phones today don't even last 5 days. So, I looked into an even smaller battery, the smallest one that they sell, and it's 11 milliamps. And then I calculated, according to his estimate, if he was getting 83 days on a 1500 milliamp, that would be 15 hours on a tiny hybrid supercapacitor, and that would be extraordinary if you could convert, if a phone could use a supercapacitor as a continuously discharging battery. I mean, that's what it is. And these things, these are relatively new technologies. It wasn't until 2001 that a research group was able to bring the idea of a hybrid ion capacitor into existence. And it wasn't even until 2010 that they made a breakthrough in developing lithium titanium oxide, carbon nanofibers, and there's also sodium ion capacitors, which are cheaper and probably greener. So you have this paper here. I just saw the paper a little while ago. Comprehensive. So this is what a lithium ion capacitor looks like on the inside. It is a hybrid. It has one cathode with a activated carbon, and then it also has a lithium doped carbon anode. Now the anode is similar to a lithium ion battery. I can't count all the little lithium ions, but it looks like it doesn't have the lithium. I think that's cobalt and oxide, or it's lithium. I don't think it's carbonate. Carbonate would be CO3. But anyways, you have here a lithium ion battery, and this is a lithium ion capacitor. So it's much safer. It is, you can ship it without restrictions, non-toxic, doesn't need protection service. So there's a ton of, advantages to using it, even if it charges in an hour. Now, it charges in seconds, but I don't know how practical that would be, especially if you're using like a solar panel, because it may not actually be charging. But technically, if it can charge and you have a surplus amount of energy generation, you could actually use more power than you're actually using. But anyways, this does have a 100,000 K charge cycle, so it's actually supposed to last, more than a couple years in terms of holding, 80% of the charge, which is typically the standard measurement of how they, measure the lifespan of a battery. So 100,000 charges, that is identical to a capacitor, which, is designed to last more than, a few years. So getting back to this paper, I mean, yeah, there are a lot of different, components in a lithium-ion capacitor, but overall it seems a lot safer than a lithium-ion battery. Then there's another thing here. The size of it is definitely going to be a bit larger. If you can see that, I mean, that's a little bit flatter. You may not be able to fit that into a phone, but you could definitely fit that into a laptop. But, I mean, the smallest one could definitely fit into it, and it could run 15 hours. So that is a game changer. I mean, you have a battery that's running at basically 10 15 hours. If you just combine it with a very low power display, like one that's only using 15 250 microwatts. I mean, that is really impressive. This is running at 6.5 frames per second. Pretty fast if you're just sending a text message. You know, obviously if you have a display and you need it to run a lot faster, you know, it does run faster than that. This is running at 30 frames per second. So, you know, it is able to run at faster than, you know, 6.5 frames per second. But, you know, looking at the spec sheet here, this is 250 microwatts for 2 frames per second. That's quite a bit less than 1 milliwatt. And, you know, you combine this with a lithium ion capacitor, and you have like a completely different phone that runs the same amount of time as a regular phone, and you have a completely different screen, and you have a completely different, you know, microcontroller. Like, that's a really interesting way of developing a phone. You have a phone out there today that runs on a microcontroller called the Mudita phone. It's an e-ink phone, and it's interesting because, you know, it doesn't have to use like a really bright light. Like, it's nice to have a phone that's just for, you know, checking the time, sending a text message, making a call. Like, you don't really need you don't even need a display. Like, if you really just wanted to make a call, like, you don't actually need a display. But it's running at 600 megahertz, and it's got 64 megabytes of RAM. So, like, there are other microcontrollers out there, like this Cortex M4 that's running at 192 megahertz, and it's got 2 MB of RAM. So, you know, how low can you go? If you can develop this thing and it's running at a third of the speed of a phone that's out there, like, that's interesting. You can almost develop a microkernel like QNX, like those Blackberries or those old Nokia phones with Symbian, and you could actually get a phone on something running at, you know, 1 milliamp, and that thing could run with a 1 milliamp display, and you could actually get a cell phone, even though your lithium ion capacitor has replaced your ion, and it's only running at maybe 1/100th of the milliamp hours. I mean, you have 11 milliamp hours. That is 1/100th of an 1100 milliamp battery. But you've already lowered the power consumption of the entire phone just by combining the lowest power microcontroller and the lowest power display. And not only that, but, you know, there's the radio that's using 127 kbps. If you limit the radio to basically like a telephone audio, you know, 32 kbps it's like MP3 quality audio. I mean, it's not like CD quality, but it's pretty good audio if you have lossy or compressed audio. And then you have the lithium ion capacitor, and then you could also run this at 3.3 volts because as you can see here, this was rated for 3.3 volt output. So with these capacitors, you can only run them with a comparable device. So this here is the one I have, and I know that it uses a 3.3 volts input. So you have to use like the special plug for that. I mean, you can find them anywhere, but these things use 3.3 volts input. So you don't need a buck converter, you don't need a boost converter. You could just use whatever connects to this, and apparently it does run within that range. So you could actually connect something like that to a 384 KB RAM microcontroller, and you could run it for 5 days or even 15 hours on a tiny lithium ion capacitor. And not only that, but this one is version 2, which uses 3.3 volts.
This is my latest solar harvesting board. It's the AEM LIC V2, and it stores solar energy into a lithium ion capacitor. It's an update to my old board. Both boards, they efficiently store solar energy, and they are based on the EP solar energy, very low power.
Okay, so I'm just gonna skip a little ahead here, but the version 2, it has a 3.3 volt output, 400 mil. It can output up to 400 milliamp plus 2.2 volt. That's definitely going to be good for lots of things that use 3.3 volts. Obviously, something like a Raspberry Pi would need like a boost converter to up to 5 volts, since that is going to use a different input. But a lot of microcontrollers use 3.3 volts. That's just a number I see very often. But version 1 uses 2.2 volts, and that is interesting because the Apollo 4 has RAM that runs at only 1.8 volts. So the operating voltage is 1.71 volts to 2.2 volts. And then it's using like a buck converter, I think. So if you're using a lithium ion capacitor, you need to use something that's going to down-regulate the voltage from 3.3 volts to 2.2 volts. I'm guessing that's the version 1 of the EP's 10941. So you could actually use a different type of power management that runs at 3.3 and then it down converts it. But of course, I don't know that much about how to down regulate. I don't build BCBs. I just kind of have a ballpark understanding of voltages. So it has to match the voltage that is incoming, unless you have some sort of regulator, step converter. So there's 2.2 volts. You could run something like an Ambic Apollo 4, and that's running at it says 4, but I also read it runs at 5 microamps per megahertz. And this has 2 megabytes of RAM. So running that on a lithium ion capacitor continuously basically means that you could really run solar powered phones with very little charging speed. It charges in seconds. So really you're only limited by the size of your panel. It's not like one of those USB chargers where you have to plug it in and it's running for an hour. It could actually charge in seconds. So So again, of course, if you're using something like a laptop, you have a little bit more space for your solar panel. But if you have something like a small phone, if you're in sunlight, I mean, you can basically charge your phone in seconds. If you're, in the middle of a sunny day and you're outside and you're, you know, getting plenty of sunlight, like, they charge pretty quickly if you have just a little bit of sunlight. And of course, you probably aren't going to be using your phone all day, but or you're probably not going to be charging your phone all day, not that you would want to, but like if you have a solar panel and you're even by like a window, it's gonna charge that thing pretty quickly. And if you don't have a lot of light, you could probably still charge some of it. Not that you would want to, charge it with artificial light, since that wouldn't be very efficient. But if you don't have any outlets, of course, that's still going to be more than enough in some cases. If you have, a bright ceiling lamp. But yeah, that's all I really wanted to cover. If you are interested in this and want to contribute to this project, this is one of the projects that I have interacted with a bit. It's not my project, but I have another project that I work on. And so all I really do is just I combine, I just make this page of links. It's not even really any. The last thing I did on this for research was like a year or like 2 years ago, and all I did was just solar power this Artemis board. It runs at 1 milliamp, and I just made it on this theory that it would be solar powered without a battery because it only uses 1 milliamp. Now this is 1% efficient because you have all these cables here. This is a 5-watt panel, so running it on a boost converter and all that, there's a lot of efficiency that's being lost here. But even then, this is probably 0.1% efficient, and you can still get 5 milliwatts in power of that. So that is 5 milliwatts, or it's probably 22 milliwatts with all those lights on. And this is 5,000 watts, 5,000 milliwatts. So 500 milliwatts is 10% efficient. 500 milliwatts, and this is 5 milliwatts. So it's probably like 2% efficient if it's running at 10 milliwatts. If it's using 20 milliwatts, it's probably 3% efficient. And you can get away with that. Like, this is a little solar panel with one light. Imagine being in a room with like 3 lights or CFLs or a ton of, or just skylights. I mean, that thing is going to charge your phone even with a tiny little solar panel. So this is 32 bit, and you have 250 microwatt. Like, I can't think of many other components other than the RAM and extra refreshes, maybe running at 30 frames per second, and maybe constantly running a Bluetooth. Obviously, Wi-Fi is something you may not really need that much, but if you have all these other antennas, I mean, you could really change how you develop phones and laptops. So I think that these are going to be more common in the future. Maybe not 5 years, but maybe 6 years. You're probably going to see these in a lot of products, because this is a very it kind of operates in a very like narrow, gooey wall, like it's like between two very common, technologies, but it's like this. It operates like in this, I don't know, this twilight zone of technologies that are like either exotic or just haven't, landed on Roswell desert or something. But anyways, if you like this video, feel free to comment or subscribe or any, anything that you would like to contribute would be very helpful. I'm really just looking for developers. Information is welcome. That's all I really do. I don't really do research myself. I just, look for information. And, as you can see here, I just have a lot of really interesting software that I think could be, combined with these low-powered things. So if you look up the source code of EKA2, it's actually available on GitHub, and the very first Symbian kernel with that used one microcontroller, one processor, was released in 2005. So the reason the EKA2 kernel is interesting is because it actually uses one microcontroller, one application processor for both the antenna that connects to the cell phone tower and the operating system Symbian. And if you look at the Nokia 225 4G, and if you watch a video on it, it looks very similar to the Symbian OS. And this is a single core processor. So if you look at a video of Nokia 225 4G, because I used to own some of the old Symbians, the E63 I had, and it's like a real-time operating system. Well, it's got a camera phone, yeah, just like the old ones. So very, very similar to, just trying to find where the menu is. Yeah, the menu screen is, so the menus of these are very similar to the old ones. Of course, they're using a lot more RAM now, but if you look at some of the old Symbians, they only ran on like 4 megabytes. The very first Symbian, Nokia 7650, this was a phone released in early 2003 or 2002 and 2001, and it only had 4 megabytes of RAM. Now, it wasn't using the EKA2, but if this could be ported, it was in Minority Report. So very futuristic for its time. But yeah, this was a very like low resolution phone, and this is something you could actually, I wouldn't say emulate, but if you could actually port this to the Ambic Apollo 4 with like Symbian, like that would actually allow you to use a single microcontroller for both the signal stack and the operating system. So not only would you have like accomplished two, very power intensive, tasks on a single microcontroller, but you've also lowered the cost of of selling the phone. And I think that's the kind of the strategy with the Nokia 225. Like, this is the cheapest phone you can buy in America. It is a $44.99 phone. You know, it's on sale for $5. And you kind of wonder, like, how do they even manufacture this phone for, if they're selling it for $44.90? Like, they've got to be taking some kind of shortcuts. And of course, you know, if you're using an application processor and you're using a memory management unit, you are going to need more RAM, and you probably want to use it if it's so cheap to you know, buy RAM. And RAM does cost a lot less. I mean, it does cost more in a certain way, but you know, back in the 90s and the 80s, like, RAM was incredibly expensive. So, you know, you had a very creative time in engineering and computer in Silicon Valley, where a lot of engineers were very, they had to be creative, they had to be very cost-cutting, they had to, you know, take shortcuts, and you can't really call them, you know, bad for doing it. But, you know, if you think about how much software we use today, a lot of it is really dependent on hardware that has fortunately become a lot cheaper. So because of this, you know, mass production of all this hardware, it's easy to buy, you know, 64 megabytes of RAM for very low cost. But, you know, on the flip side, what's happened, you know, over all these years is that a lot of software has gotten bloated, and one of the downsides of that is that it hasn't really, there hasn't been a whole lot of pressure to downsize some of these hardware. Like, there's really no incentive to develop something that's running at, you know, 2 frames a second and using all this low power, because there's all these, you know, all these brand new apps that, you know, you want to use. So if, of course, if you can afford only one phone, then, you know, this is not something you're probably going to want to use, because you probably have to use a banking app, or you probably need to use a phone for a bunch of other things. But one of the benefits of having a phone that's not convergent with a lot of these new technologies is you can actually get back to a lot of the basics of communication. And it can actually be a lot, you know, more less distracting. So, you know, it's not necessarily that this should be your only phone, and that, you know, that's not the whole point of this video. It's really to emphasize a lot of the technologies that have not really gotten a lot of you know, emphasis because they were a very low priority. But if you look at a lot of these, how well these technologies perform, that, you know, they have a lot of new utility, and when you combine them with you know, a new technology, it really gives you a lot more application to using them, because a lot of these things are not even possible until, like, one bottleneck is removed, and that bottleneck has to be that the power consumption of all of them has to be less than what with a solar panel can produce. So if all of these things are using, you know, only 6 milliamps, but, you know, your solar panel is only generating 1 milliamp, you're definitely going to be, you know, running out of power if you continue to use it, because it's not generating enough power to recharge it. but again, the thing is that if you are going to be outside, and if you leave your house, you obviously have a chance to charge your phone. It causes like this change in behavior of how you charge your phone, because you may be used to plugging something in, because outlets are reliable, and most people live near power, but not everybody has access to an outlet. So that's all I really wanted to cover. Just the solar panels are not immediately what comes to mind when you think of cell phones, but there is quite a bit of opportunity for these things to be integrated if if all the right components are designed that way. I do think there is quite a bit of to go with it, but it does look like some of these technologies in lithium-ion capacitors do offer potential in charging devices faster, because because the capacitor has a quicker recharge time in seconds, and also because all the components use quite a bit less power. So thank you so much for watching this video. Yep, I think I have covered everything here. I think, yeah, this 500 hertz. It's definitely cool. I think it's great, but I do think there should be more phones out there with more options, and when it comes to refresh rates. Um, so, yep, I won't hold you any longer. Thank you so much for watching.